Raza, what are Pakistan's options right now? When the leaders in Pakistan hear what the president had to say in that speech, what options do they have? Where do they go with this?
Well, I mean, I think Pakistan's both civil and military elites would like to repair this relationship. I don't think that Pakistan is looking for a complete breakdown or estrangement, even though Mr. Trump's remarks were very harsh. But Pakistan's options, unfortunately, are constrained largely due to the India factor. And that is, again, something that Mr. Trump actually has given some very worrying signals by asking India to do more in Afghanistan. That is exactly the kind of red flag to Pakistan, because Pakistan's Afghan policy is largely dictated by its long-standing rivalry with India. And Pakistan's entire effort in the last decades has been to somehow reduce or minimize Indian influence on its western borders. And by Mr. Trump asking India to intervene, it is only going to escalate the tensions between these two nuclear-armed nations. And that, to me, is very worrying. God forbid, I mean, you know, if something terrible happens, I mean, who's going to be responsible? But leaving that aside, I think you earlier brought in the Chinese statement, and I think it is also linked to that particular Chinese-American rivalry in the region. I mean, not rivalry, but, you know, influence peddling for both in West Asia and Asia. And I think the US sees India as its formidable partner now that Pakistan is completely in China's orbit of influence.
Afshin, we hear talk of defeating the Taliban. We hear talk of overcoming the threat that the Taliban poses. But something we don't hear about very often is negotiating with the Taliban. Is there going to come a time when the United States and its allies say, listen, we're going to have to talk to the Taliban if we're going to find some long-lasting solution here?
I think that there certainly is going to have to, that time is going to have to come. Now, having said that, I think the time is not now. I think that with this mini troop surge of an extra 4,000 advisors, I mean, the calculus on the ground has to change before any negotiations with the Taliban begin. The Taliban have been winning, you know, to use Donald Trump's favorite phrase, in Afghanistan. And the Afghan security forces have proven themselves unable to defeat the Taliban. I'm not sure if these 4,000 extra troops are the answer. I think at some point there is going to have to be a local Afghanistan-based solution, but the time is not now to negotiate. There have to be some more defeats of the Taliban on the ground before the negotiations can begin.
Michael, spell out for us how you see this strategy unfold in Afghanistan. So let's say 4,000 more troops are sent. That's a policy of containment, isn't it?
I generally, yeah, I do believe that the ultimate goal here is to get a negotiated settlement, and it is the most reasonable objective. I mean, what we don't want to see happen, which happened under Bill Clinton's watch in 1996, is the Taliban, you know, rolling into Kabul, taking it by military force. That will not happen under this administration. It will be stopped, and that's the message that was sent in the speech last night, and in the troop and advisor deployment that's to come in the days and weeks to come. That should hopefully stall and maybe even move back the Taliban's advance and other terrorist movements in the country considerably, I think, and hopefully create an environment where there can be a reasonable solution. Because that I agree, I think we all agree on this issue. Afghanistan has to be governed by Afghans. We're not there to tell them how to govern. We're not telling them, you know, what their ideology should be. We're simply saying you are not going to, you know, take a government by force or create an environment in which threatening terrorist forces are able to train and plan attacks on the United States and our allies and friends around the world. Okay. And so I think ultimately, yes, negotiation is reasonable. There's nothing that we should be shameful in saying that's the goal, and I'm hopeful that that will be the objective, but you can't do that from a position of weakness.
Okay, Simon?
But with respect, Michael, I'm not convinced that there is unanimous agreement about that. If you take a look at what today Laura Ingraham, who once was being tipped as a communications director, a White House press secretary for Donald Trump, was saying on her radio show here in the United States, she said that Donald Trump was elected to put America first, to drain the swamp, and not to clear the desert. And so there is an intense critique of what Donald Trump is doing by expanding this military operation in Afghanistan. And it's not coming from the Democrats, and it's not even coming from mainstream Republicans up on Capitol Hill. It's coming from core Donald Trump supporters, Laura Ingraham, Stephen Bannon, Breitbart News. They say, get out.
Well, you know, and I know all these guys. I think they are great allies of the president, and I agree with them conceptually as well. I mean, clearly you're right. The campaign was run around ending some of these entanglements, getting our allies to share their burden. The nuance here that I think is likely lost on them, but not lost on generals and the National Security Council and Pentagon, is the fact that this situation in Afghanistan is not today what it was before. And the way to avoid a vastly expanded threat and even a more significant level of engagement is to contain it now. So it is very sensitive politically. I do not think the American people have a great degree of patience or appetite, you know, for a sustained engagement in Afghanistan. We've been there over 16 years already, spent somewhere in the area of, you know, billions of dollars, right. Lost over 2,400 lives. But, you know, this is really the mechanism, I think, to bring this to an end with dignity and to allow Afghanistan to be governed by Afghans in a way that is not threatening to U.S. interests.
And Anand, if I may right here, it's very, you know, to Laura Ingraham and Steve Bannon and all those who say cut and run and get out, be careful what you wish for. Vacuums like that are not filled by Norway. They are filled by malign actors, and those malign actors will come after the United States once again.
Right. I mean, Breitbart was very critical.
And we properly criticized that approach under the Obama administration. It would be somewhat hypocritical to now embrace it. And even though I'm very respectful of that view, and I think it reflects the 60 million Americans who voted for the president.
Right. Raza, I'm going to look at one of the broader implications of what the president said in his speech, and you touched upon this. I'm just wondering if he complicated the situation even further. There could be one unintended consequence of the president's speech. The United States business network, CNBC, is reporting that this address could deepen the divide between arch enemies, India and Pakistan. These are two nuclear-armed neighbors. He slammed Pakistan, as we heard in that speech, and then and this is what he said about India. He said the United States will further develop its strategic partnership with India. Now, shouldn't the leader of the United States be seeking to unite these two countries rather than deepening the divide between them?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is one of the biggest problems with this new, outline of a strategy, because we still don't have much of the detail here. But the U.S. has to, everybody expected that the U.S. would play a role in brokering some kind of a working relationship between these two countries, which are both nuclear armed, which have large number of people living in hunger, poverty, and other lack of social development. And instead, this ratcheting up of military language is very worrying for the region. This is not going to be taken well in Pakistan, and even though the Indians would be euphoric, as in they have gotten the superpowers sort of blessings, but it's only going to complicate things further. And I think that is very worrying, not just for the region, but for the world as well, because this was a moment for Donald Trump to actually play a constructive role in bringing these two countries together. But I also want to add, just respond to the earlier points made. Yeah. This is not the 18th century or the 19th century. In 2017, you can't actually be in a country and, occupy it and run it. I mean, 16 years, the contradiction is I mean, that's the thing, that, the Taliban are actually waging a struggle against the U.S., what they call, quote-unquote, occupation. That is the whole raison d'etre of their struggle. And with the continued engagement of the U.S., it's not going to end anything. It's only going to increase their resolve.
All right, very quickly, Michael.
I would actually say if there's been any recurring theme throughout the history of Afghanistan, the modern history of Afghanistan, it's been the inability of any foreign power to occupy it. And the British weren't able to do it. The Soviets didn't learn that lesson. They invaded in 1979, sustained thousands of casualties in what was their Vietnam War. And obviously, we've had a difficult time as well. And so I think it's important to reemphasize that this president is not looking to occupy Afghanistan. We want to get around to solving the problems here in the United States, but that includes first and foremost his constitutional responsibility to defend the American people from terrorist attack.
Okay.
And that is a real, serious, present tense threat with what's transpiring in Afghanistan right now.
Simon, talking about the Soviets in Afghanistan, we had a development today in Washington on Tuesday, which is kind of dripping with irony. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, criticized Russia for supplying weapons to the Taliban to fight the United States.
He did do that, but he did it in the most measured of possible terms, and he made it all conditional. To the extent that Russia may be doing this, if Russia is doing this, then the United States would send the Russians a signal that this was no-go and a breach of UN Security Council resolutions. So, as ever, with this administration and Russia, there's a curiosity about the fact that there is a hesitation to speak out and a hesitation to confront Moscow, not just on this issue, but on any issue. I mean, the other point worth making today is that there was a collective yawn from Europe as a result of the president's speech last night. He insisted to the Americans that he was going to be making sure that the NATO allies matched America's commitment. Well, the Brits immediately turned around a few hours ago and said, we just sent 85 more troops into Afghanistan in June. We are tapped out. And there was no indication from other parts of Europe that the NATO allies were preparing to double down and match what the United States is planning to do, because they look at Donald Trump and they see a presidential leader who they believe is, at the very least, seriously wounded, if not mortally wounded.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you. We're going to have to end it there. Sorry, we've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat.